Not a lot of people know about it necessarily, real estate strategy and real estate consulting. So I
Hmm.
think a lot of people don't realize they need it. It's probably the bigger problem is the
Okay.
developers not knowing that it's an option to have some support in this area and that ultimately in making that investment up front in the consulting and strategy, no one can read your mind. And I think if there's something that you are dissatisfied with in your role, like you're in charge of your own destiny,
Right.
ultimately, either like speak up or find the next thing
Yeah.
and make it work for you.
Welcome to the Job Dictionary podcast. Today, I'm going to be interviewing Chesley McCarty, and she is going to talk to us about real estate strategy, the work she has done in the past, and just overall give us an overview of what being in that industry is like. So, welcome, Chesley. And
Thank
first
you.
off, I'm going to start with three very quick questions that we ask all of our guests. Okay. So, in your own words, what do you do? Where do you live? And as a kid, what did you want to do when you grew up?
Ooh, what do I do? Where do I live? And what did I want to do?
Yes.
Okay. I currently work in the residential side of real estate, but I have spent the last 7 years working in real estate strategy and real estate consulting, five of them at a company called Street Sense, which we'll be talking about mostly today. I live in Washington, D.C., and I've lived here for 7 years. Did not expect that this was going to become home, but it
I
is now.
I love DC. I am so jealous. I love to hear that.
DC is great. Yeah, DC is a
Beautiful.
beautiful place, especially
It
for
is.
someone who loves architecture. So I love being here. And what did I think I was going to be when I grew up? I wanted to be an architect, actually. So it's funny that that all sort of stacked together. I'm not a licensed architect, but I went to architecture school, and now very much am working in design, so it all checks out.
That's amazing. I love to
Yeah,
hear that. And again, like I love DC. That is amazing. And life over there
it's a
has
good
to be
place.
wonderful. Literally, yeah.
Yeah,
Okay. Okay, so for the first question today, I would just love to know how long did you work in this field of real estate strategy?
I worked in it for a total of about, I would say, 6 years. So I started off at Gensler, which is a big architecture firm, in the consulting side. I decided pretty quickly I did not want to practice architecture and become a licensed architect. I figured that out in architecture school. But then at Gensler, I started doing a little bit more real estate consulting, which was not necessarily a new thing, but people were just starting to put words around it. And then I went over to Street Sense, where I did that full time for 5 years, I would say.
Awesome. And you mentioned a little bit that you got into it after deciding architecture was not for you, but what actually made you decide to go into real estate strategy within the company?
For sure. Yeah, so I love architecture, I love design, but I also love just strategic big picture thinking, which I feel like a lot of people really enjoy now. Very much a buzzword. And it felt like real estate strategy and consulting, at least when I started doing it at Gensler, was a good touch point on a lot of things that I was interested in. And then when the opportunity presented itself at Street Sense, they actually found out about me before I found out that that was an opportunity. So they reached out, and it ended up being a very synergistic match of what I was doing at the time to be able to do that, instead of one or two projects a year at Gensler, that became my full-time focus. So I loved that it was very sort of like crafting a narrative
Natural.
of a space instead of just doing architectural drawings is a very
Yeah,
tedious process. So
that's awesome. And are there certain degrees or certifications that you believe are required to get into this role?
I don't think it takes something specific. I do think understanding how architecture works and how floor plan works is very valuable, but you don't have to go to architecture school in order to understand that. I think people that come in with a business background or any sort of design background, but are interested in the other parts and pieces of the whole real estate development process are best suited to thinking in this sort of way. I do think you have to be spatially oriented, for lack of a better word. So I think if you're not someone who necessarily, when you walk into a beautiful hotel that your friend is
Admire.
obsessed with, and like that doesn't really sing to you, and you can't articulate like what makes it so special. I think in the particular role that I was in, it would be challenging to like talk the talk, because that's a lot of what we had to do, was like sell a lifestyle that could exist in this particular development and be able to articulate our recommendations accordingly.
Okay, that is
Yeah.
awesome. I'm learning a lot today. I didn't even know
Yeah.
that this is a
It's a
role in real estate.
very niche role. I don't know how many people are doing it, but our little team at Street Sense is doing it.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. And are there any other job titles that you think this position goes by, or does it usually just go by real estate strategy blank?
I would say I don't think there's a ton of people doing it, honestly. I think it's kind of hard to find. I think if you were to look up real estate strategist, some options would show up, but they might not be necessarily in this vein that we were in, which is really supporting on the private development side and on the retail
Okay.
side specifically. But I think as you start knocking on doors, if you talk with people, if there's a like Target would probably have a real estate strategy component, but I don't know how they would advertise it. So I think it's more so knocking on the private developers' doors and seeing if that's something that they need support with, or if they have a team that's doing that, as well as, you look at a place like Sweet Green, for example, they've
Mhm.
definitely got a real estate strategist
Yeah.
that they are working with alongside their brokerage team to figure out, the best locations for them to invest in.
Yeah. And hey, this is really interesting. I know you're saying it's very niche. I am not from the US, so I grew up in Venezuela down in South America. And I feel like
Okay, cool.
this, which you're talking about, is very common. Like I do see, different
Mm,
places have like a very thought out internal design and kind of luxurious feel, kind of what you were discussing
for
earlier.
sure.
Interested to see
Yeah.
if that's gonna grow like throughout the
For
US.
sure. I
Yeah.
think also looking at this is having to sort of look behind more potentially closed doors, but if there's a place, if there is sort of at least in the particular role that I was in, if there is a sort of retail focused destination that you really love and that feels really interesting and special to you, and it's the place that you recommend that your friends go to, and I'm thinking about Austin right now, you know, there's so many new retail developments in Austin, but if one of those comes to mind, figuring out who develops that and what brokerage helped to figure out the retail decisions, that's the person that you want to talk to be able to do more work like this. So,
Okay.
yeah,
Awesome. And okay, could you share a bit of what a day in the life was like when you were in a role of real estate strategy?
yes, yeah. And I should clarify, I guess, briefly that I was doing it for 6 years and then I left to go full time on my own
Yes.
and am now like building my own little business. Just
Amazing.
in case it's not clear that I was in that about 6 months ago. Said my sad goodbyes. A day in the life. I think for me, I mean, I was there for 5 years, so it changed quite a bit. I sort of saw myself as sort of a conductor in a way. And because our real estate strategy deliverables are these very comprehensive, multifaceted consulting decks that touch on a lot of different components. Like we had to do the market analysis and the upfront research to figure out who's our competition. There was a big sort of tenanting and merchandising piece where we were figuring out, at this corner of this, if we've got 100,000 square feet to work with, how many restaurants do we need full service? How many fast casual restaurants? How many apparel shops? Who are those tenants in that check those boxes in this particular market? What type of tenant would resonate with our target audience? We did a whole sort of audience review. I'm probably giving more detail now than I need to. But my main role in all of that was coordinating all of these different inputs of data, both like qualitative and quantitative, and synthesizing it and then putting it into a beautiful InDesign deck in a way, anti PowerPoint, to help tell that story and to ultimately convince our client that these are the areas in the project that you need to invest in order to have the result that you want and to attract the user that you want to spend money at your development.
Yeah.
So I was in the middle of that like melting pot of inputs, I would say.
Okay. So really like understanding data, being able to analyze it and present it in a way that like how is this going to benefit you, if you organize retail in this way within this
For sure.
development. Okay. Awesome.
Yeah. Well, and I think another way to think about it too is, a lot of people in a more formal consulting role, like if you're looking
Mhm.
at big consulting firms, a lot of the data that they're looking at is very quantitative, like it's hard data that they can synthesize and generate a response to that's
Yes.
very actionable. A lot of what we are working with is more qualitative and subjective. And so much of my role was taking something that didn't formally present itself as data and figuring out a way to sort of process it and study it, regurgitate it and then prove to the client if they do X, Y, and Z, they're going to drive ABC in value, or I guess if they do ABC, drive X, Y, Z.
Yeah.
So I think that was a lot of what we spent a lot of our time trying to resolve is how do we make something, this would be my boss's words at the time, like how do you make an art a science in a way? Because the places that you love that really resonate with you, a lot of the places that you absolutely love, figuring out what makes those places sing. There's not necessarily a one size fits all solution. So
Right. Okay, so I noticed you kind of compared this a little bit to being a consultant, but a little bit different. Would you say
for
at all,
sure.
I'm curious that the big consultant firms might have like a division that does kind of this type of role?
I know from the time that I was sort of poking around that there are real estate consulting opportunities at bigger consulting firms, but it's, I think, a very different type of work. So you might be
Okay.
doing, like a growth strategy for a fast casual that's trying to figure out which locations to go to. I think that team might partner with a retail brokerage to find the answer to that. I don't think it would be as niche of a product in those
Okay.
particular companies. Yeah, I think the work that we were getting to do and the projects we were getting to work on were very bespoke and boutique, for lack of a better word. And I really liked that part of it because I'm the girl that like loves to give people the best restaurant recommendations and hotel recommendations. And our work was very aligned with that. Whereas at, you know, Accenture doing retail strategy, you might
Right.
be in DC, you might actually be working with like a government entity to
Right.
figure out how to optimize their real estate portfolio, which could be really cool, but that's going to be much more like data focused
Gotcha.
and methodical,
Yeah.
which doesn't appeal to me, but might appeal to someone else.
Yeah,
So,
so different ways to go about it, different preferences. So more
yeah,
boutique is a different experience than on the larger companies. Thank you for sharing that.
yeah.
And okay, Chesley, so what tools or technologies would you say that you used very often uh, on the day-to-day at this job?
Adobe InDesign,
Okay,
99.9% of the time is where I spend most of my time. A
awesome.
little bit of Excel. I was learning how and got to a place where I was definitely able to manage some of the high level economic analysis that we would do. So if we had, 100,000 square feet of retail space we're looking at with 5 restaurants, uh, 4 fast casuals, and 4 like retail shops, just as an example, we would figure out, how much rent are each of those going to command in this market, and then ultimately every year, how much sales could you expect? So
Okay.
in that, we were doing some Excel work. That wasn't always my favorite, but I would say those two things are probably what we use the most.
Thank you.
Yeah,
And okay, could you share a little bit with me about what part of your job was the most interesting, exciting for you?
yeah. I started pre-COVID and we traveled a lot, which I loved and
It's
I think was
fun.
unexpected. So, and it was a really fun team to get to travel with. And the purpose of our travel was really cool. We were expected to definitely be really in the know of what's the coolest hotel in this market and who are the restaurateurs that we need to be talking to and familiar with. So getting to have exposure to those types of spaces felt like, well, this is how I would spend my free time going to Austin anyways. And
Yeah.
my role initially on the team before we started growing is to figure out, if we are going to Austin for 3 days for a project there, what are the restaurants we need to see? What are the hotels we need to see? So it felt like being a little travel planner, and
It's
that was
fun.
a lot of fun. So of
Yeah.
course we didn't travel a ton during COVID, and then as I was leaving, we were starting to do more. That's a piece that I miss.
Yeah, no, I get that. Traveling is always so fun. And I feel like everybody that travels with work loves it to some extent because they get to see
Yeah,
different places.
for
Okay,
sure.
so we talked about what you love the most. Now, could you share a little bit of what might have been the most emotionally challenging, maybe even boring when you were working in real
Mm.
estate strategy?
I think it's definitely challenging to be coordinating among a lot of different teams that have different processes in place. So as I was leaving, a lot of our teams were starting to come under one umbrella as opposed to being in different places and to have a little bit of like alignment in the processes that we were using. And we were starting to do bigger projects where we all had a seat at the table and we were all delivering together like one deliverable, as opposed to this is the research team's deliverable, this is the urban planning team's deliverable, and then here's our retail deliverable. So I think that was definitely challenging to coordinate all of those voices, to sort of bring everyone to the same level of
Right.
analysis and synthesis, of presentation. So I think that was the place that created the most like road bumps. But I'm trying to think of other challenges. No, that's really what comes to mind. So
Awesome. Would you say that was an experience you had because it was a more boutique, niche position within the company you were at, or do you
yeah,
think it's a general thing that people would face on the day to day?
I think that we were sort of like building the ship as it sails in a way. So
Okay.
my boss and the other sort of leader I was working under have been working in commercial real estate for 20, 30 years. So they're really familiar with how the process works, but then how to take like what's in their head and put it on paper in a way that's convincing is harder for some people than others. I think that at a larger firm that's doing more of like the example that I gave earlier, that kind of real
Mhm.
estate strategy, they probably have, systems in place and structure in place where you're just like feeding it in, you're doing the analysis, but then feeding it into a PowerPoint. Um, I think for us, we were figuring out not just how to do it and present it, but I think I'm someone who loves like infographics and synthesizing hard data into a really
Right.
beautiful and interesting
Visual way.
way. And we were always sort of trying to push the boundary there of how exceptional could we make our deliverables seem for the most like sometimes bland of opportunities. And I think at a larger firm, you're not given the same creative license because they've got like templates that you fill in. So I lost track of the question, but I don't think you would. I think it would just depend on where you're at in terms of running into that,
Okay.
if that
Yeah.
makes sense.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for sharing that. And okay, would you say that in your time working as a real estate strategist, you were able to leave work at the office during, your 9 to 5 time, for example, or would you say you actually took a lot of that home?
I was lucky to be on a team where work-life balance was very respected.
Awesome.
So I owe all of that to my boss and sort of the tone that he set. I think it would depend on the company you were at and the team dynamic that you were on. But I think there were only a few times where I had to work on the weekends. Yeah.
Perfect. That's great. Work-life balance is
We love to
important.
hear it.
We love to hear it. And okay, so within this, strategy role, I would assume there is a lot of collaboration. And from everything you've shared, I can see that is
Yeah.
true. Were there remote hours, hybrid hours, or was most of your role in person at the office?
For me and for our team, we were all hybrid, not hybrid even, probably say, I would say more remote,
Okay.
all living in, like we had one person on the team who was out in California and just people all over. So I think over time it might end up being maybe less so like in the office because we all live all over, but I think meeting while traveling, like meeting at a project site for a site visit
Yes.
is the opportunity to all be together. So, but I think most of us kind of work and I feel like we're all running into this in all of our industries. I work well independently and I
Yeah.
like being able to work from home. And I think our team was able to see that that worked well for our productivity. So,
Awesome.
yeah,
And would you say there was a time of the year where things got really busy, or would you say that it stayed consistent throughout the year?
I would say it was pretty consistent throughout the year. I think it would just depend like project by project. And there were some projects like we worked on Grand Central Terminal, I remember was one of the first like big retail strategy projects we worked on. And that took a lot more time and commitment than we expected.
Mhm.
And it wasn't necessarily a seasonal thing, but I think leading up to the production, the final production of deliverable was like all in. And I remember doing late nights and working some weekends in advance of the final presentation. But other times with smaller retail strategy projects, it was like, we've done this 20 times before. It's going to be the same like type of process. I think
Okay.
there were other ones similar to Grand Central where we've done a lot of work with the MTA and those were always opportunities to like really push the boundaries of how we talk through a really challenging like spatial dynamic and the strategy for it. But that didn't fall seasonally. No, that work.
Awesome. So it's just depending on the project. That's
Yeah,
how things will be determined. Awesome. And
yeah.
could you share with me maybe something that people tend to underestimate about this specific profession?
I think that, I mean, not a lot of people know about it necessarily, real estate strategy and real estate consulting. So I
Hmm.
think a lot of people don't realize they need it necessarily. It's probably the bigger problem is the developers
Okay.
not knowing that it's an option to have some support in this area, and that ultimately in making that investment up front in the consulting and strategy, you are driving a lot of
Getting a better
additional
return.
value in the back end. So I think that's one piece of it, as well as quantifying, these spatial adjustments in the project actually do you get a physical return on that investment
Right.
ultimately. And I think some people don't necessarily believe that. Like if I were to say the quality of this light is like too warm or too cool, and that matters, some developers would agree
I'll be
or
like,
disagree with that sentiment. Yeah.
yeah.
So I think it was more so making a case to our clients ultimately that
Yeah.
these changes are a worthwhile use of your time and
Yeah.
investment.
So very detail oriented, small things that clients might not understand, but do make a difference in how people feel
Yeah,
in the experience within the retail
for
space.
sure.
Okay.
Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely.
And what about overestimating? What do you think people overestimate in the profession?
I don't know if there's anything that people overestimate. In what
Okay.
way?
Kind of like think something they overhype or an assumption that people might make about the job.
I don't think there's anything that comes to mind, honestly.
That's
Yeah.
great. That's good then. That's awesome. Okay. And Chesley, what is the fastest way that you would say is best for getting into this profession? I know you mentioned the best way
Hmm.
is to go find, the developers kind of go straight into finding who is working with them. But what
Yeah.
would you say for someone who's coming from a non-traditional background and wants to get their foot in the door?
Yeah. I think definitely connecting with Street Sense because we've got a robust team of people that are doing it. I believe they're currently hiring off the record, which is great. So,
Awesome.
but I think also definitely looking at the developers, but then also places like restaurant groups. They've got people in this role who are working in this type of way. So I think that's another good door to knock on. I do think, I don't know if this is a question that's coming up, but I do think having a familiarity with Adobe InDesign is really helpful, as
Okay.
well as understanding how to read a floor plan. Those are both things that can be taught, but I think if you're coming in without exposure already, it just removes like some pretty big speed bumps that will have to be sorted. So,
Overcome. Yeah.
yeah.
Okay. Awesome. And could you share with me, is there a specific field that you find that people who come into this profession come from? Or would you say it's more random?
I think it's a little random only because it's not a newer thing, but it's only just starting to sort of take hold as an option.
Yeah.
I think that people who come from an architecture and design background, like big A architecture
Hmm.
in a way, and are used to thinking about like mixed use, like at architecture school, we were doing mixed use development projects and thinking about hundreds of thousands of square feet of space to work with as opposed to the interior redesign of a residential home. So I think
Hmm.
coming in with that like spatial understanding that you get from architecture school, if you also decided I don't want to be a licensed architect, I like the big picture thinking. Like if you're
Okay.
listening to this and you're in architecture school and you love like the first 3 weeks of the semester when you're just getting to like do the research and think about the strategy before actually figuring out how your building is going to come together, I think this type of role would feel really good. But our
Awesome.
team also has so many, it's now under one umbrella, and we've got like the research group and a group that's focusing more on like downtown bid environments and retail streets. And then the team that I was on focusing more on the private development end. And then I think also the urban planning group got like looped into the consulting umbrella right before I left. And I would say of those probably 20 individuals, they all have a very different background.
Okay.
So like my boss didn't, I don't think went to architecture school. I think he went to business school and then like did some real estate development. So you
Awesome.
can come in from a variety of ways as long as you think spatially.
Awesome. And when you say a design background, I'm just curious, do you mean like interior design, or do you mean perhaps someone who majored in visualization, something of the sort, and is used to, visually looking at things and using different softwares? Just curious what you think.
Yeah. I think having a comfort in thinking visually is a big asset, whether that's
Okay.
coming from like a graphic design degree or somewhere else. But I think if you're coming in with a graphic design degree, the whole like business and spatial side of how a space operates, I think is going to feel like might feel really unfamiliar to you. So when I think design background, I do think like a formal, not to say like you have to have a formal architecture degree, but I think if you went to
Yes.
business school and you also love and appreciate architecture, like that would suit you well in this.
Okay.
Or like me, you went to architecture school, but like I'm an entrepreneur at heart, and that's been true for the last 7 years. So being able to have maybe that's what it is, like having an interest and an experience in architecture and design, as well as an interest and experience in some capacity in the business side of things. That's the
Okay.
combination that you need to
That's
do it
big.
well.
Awesome. And
Yeah.
so you're touching on it already, but could you share some specific skills that someone should have to be good at this job? Like what has to come easily to you other than just being a very visual person, spatially, you know, driven?
Yeah. I think to be able to articulate, and we talked about this a little bit earlier, when you walk into a beautiful hotel lobby, or
Hmm.
when you walk into a hotel lobby, to be able to articulate, is it beautiful or is it lackluster? Is it working or is it not working, and why? Or the restaurants that, like, why would you choose this restaurant over this restaurant when it comes
Right.
to a
Environment.
variety of things?
Right.
Like atmosphere can be great, but if they're doing certain things wrong, they're not going to have the sales volume that they could have. And I remember one of the first projects I did work on at Street Sense was the Grand Central Terminal,
Awesome.
huge like strategy deck.
Yeah.
And part of our assignment was to study each and every tenant that was currently in Grand Central and to mark like how are they doing in lighting, visual merchandising, the spatial geometry. I think we had two sets of studies for each tenant. One was like sort of the atmosphere and environment and performance, and then one might have been the fundamentals of the space itself. And to study like 150 of those down to that level of detail and like cross pollinate our findings to say, if these spaces literally scored a B on this and a C on this, well, how does that map with their rent performance and their sales performance,
Right.
to like triangulate that in a way?
Okay.
Um, so I'm losing track of the question, but that's what comes to mind.
Okay. Awesome. No,
Yeah.
you did a great job. So just the skill of
Okay.
being able to gather different pieces of data information and kind of create a story out
Yes.
of that to understand why something works, why it doesn't, and do it for a large amount of retailers at a time, essentially, right?
Yeah. I
Okay.
think to be able to like spot a pattern in things and to
Yes.
also, well, and the original question was it the skills that are
Yes.
useful? Yeah. Yeah. I think to be able to, like, I think about someone in sort of more my personal life, like being, and I guess this would be it, being curious about spaces and
Okay.
just curious to sort of like keep digging into, like, if you're someone who sits down with a friend and when they're telling you a story, you ask a lot of follow-up questions, then you're really curious to like look at it at different angles and to understand the multifaceted nature of something. I think that that would serve someone really well in this role, because what you initially see like isn't always reality in a way.
Okay.
And it's our job to uncover that and then figure out a solution for it.
Awesome. Thank
So,
you. Appreciate that. Okay.
yeah.
And how long would you say it takes someone to get really good at this job? I know you were in this role
Mm,
for about 6 years. So what would you say?
yeah. I would say if you're coming in without an architecture background and sort of a spatial background in some capacity, I think it will take a couple of years, like 2 years, let's say,
Hmm.
maybe, maybe less, to get comfortable with
Okay.
how all these parts and pieces work. I think that, and just sort of thinking about sort of how our team grew over time, I do think like developing a comfort in the Adobe suite is not something that a lot of people are taught in school. So just like
Hmm.
any big program, that can sometimes take a while to learn. But I think for me in the role, even though I came in with a little bit of exposure, I would say on the second year, I felt by the third year, it was like I understand kind of how all of this works and can really grow in deepening my knowledge and talking about the economic performance of a place. So I think my first year was just getting exposure to kind of how it all works.
Right.
And the first 2 years, it was a really small team that was executing on a lot. But then as we grew, I became more of that conductor role, which was a reflection of understanding the value of how all these things worked together to create a story for a place.
Awesome.
So,
And okay, so if applicable, is this a role that has a promotion path? Like from entry
mm,
level to the highest position, what is the average time that you spend at each level and how do you go upwards?
yeah, I was a just a real estate. Well, I started off when I was a Gensler, I guess I was a design strategist, and then I came in to Street Sense as a real estate strategist, and I was in that role for 3.5-ish, 4 years, and then I became a
Okay.
senior strategist.
Okay.
I think in a way there's not really a clear path because there's not like a ton of other teams to my knowledge that are doing this. So I think it's another example of the ship being built as it sails, which
Right.
is a phrase that I have come up with and use a lot. Um, so that would be my thought on that.
Awesome. Well, thank
Yeah.
you for sharing that. Yeah, I hear this with new things. Like, for example, even in user experience, user interface, that's also a newer
Yeah,
field, and newer fields are, it's kind of like learn as we go and things are being developed as they grow. So I
for
can.
sure. Yeah.
Okay, so Chesley, this is a bit of a more personal question, so feel free to share with as wide of a range as you would like. But
I
what
think I know the one that's coming.
what would be the average salary for someone, at perhaps let's say the entry level that you were at for 4 years and then, a more senior role?
Yeah. I think a good way to think about it without probably answering the question directly is,
Okay.
when I started at an architecture firm in the architecture world, if I had stayed in the architecture path, I think my earning potential would have been limited.
Okay.
I think when I started at Gensler, it was on the consulting side, I think I started at like 60,000. But then on the formal other consulting end of things, like going to an
Hmm.
Accenture, Deloitte, McKinsey, where you're going to be working a ton of hours, just to clarify, you can
Yes.
start, some people 2 years there, they're already in like the 200,000s,
Yeah.
you know? I think this particular role where you're kind of hugging both design and formal consulting, where there's leeway to push for the consulting value that you're adding, but you are working more so in the design and real estate space and bringing the design and real estate value. Um, and then also, I think it's sort of a third piece. Now that I think about it, you think about the real estate development world where there's a lot of earning potential. I think we sort of rest right in between there, I would say,
Okay.
without answering it directly because I don't want to get in trouble.
No, thank you. I appreciate that example. And
Yeah.
that is,
But I
that
think,
gives I think it gives a good, look
yeah,
up this, look up that.
for sure.
Go
Well, and I
somewhere in the
think
middle.
too, I knew when I was in an architecture firm that was also a motivator for going more towards the consulting side because I felt limited in that way and what my growth could look like if I stayed in
Yeah.
that path. But then I also didn't necessarily want to do like big technical consulting. And so I think these opportunities are a great fit for someone who is feeling similar sentiments,
Yeah.
you know.
Thank you. Appreciate you for sharing that. And then, okay, so I feel like you're the perfect person to ask this question to because you have moved on from this specific field. So, what would you say is the thing that people go on to next if they leave the real estate
Ooh,
strategy space? Are there any themes, or do you find that they go into anything?
yeah. If they leave the space or it's sort of like a
Yes.
next step after the role.
Like a
Ooh,
next step,
interesting
leave the
question.
space.
Yeah. I mean, I know for me, when I was thinking about what do I want to do next, my boss at the time caught wind that I was out looking and poking around, and in his very sweet Canadian way, this is how I tell the story every time, was just like, I'm your biggest cheerleader and want to support you in it. And some of the options that I looked at and sort of considered alongside, his expertise in a way was I looked at going into tenant representation, which is where you would work with a company like Sweetgreen, if you're lucky, and help them figure out, what are the right next markets for them to invest in, which is
Okay.
quite cool. I think that would have been a lot of fun and is still sort of on my radar as maybe a second career one day. I think that also falls under the actual brokerage umbrella where you're on the
Okay.
brokerage side. So I looked at that. I looked at going into formal like property development, looking at places like Related that developed Hudson Yards in New York and Jamestown that did Chelsea Market in Atlanta. I think it would be really cool to get to work with those teams. The downside is you're not, I love that in our consulting role, we were working on multiple things at a time for a very short amount of time. Like the longest project would be 6 months. And I think that that was the thing that discouraged me in the architecture world and would also discourage me in the property development world
Got you.
is those projects from the initial idea to like the final nail in the ground could take 20 years. Not that you're going to be working
Wow.
on it for that long, but the timeline, like you don't, and that was kind of a downside of the role. We were doing all this consulting work, but we're not necessarily going to see the fruits of that labor until it's implemented 5 years from now. You know, you're very far up in the process.
Yeah.
The other thing, I think for me, like I decided to go into the residential real estate side of things, which is very tactile and very focused on hospitality and kind of takes the parts of real estate strategy that I love and repackages them in a new way. So those are a few things that come to mind. I think also going into like formal, if you find through this job that you really love the consulting side of it, I think you can start looking at these bigger consulting firms or other boutique pure consulting firms that are doing this type, maybe not this type of work as we've talked about, but something close
Hmm.
to it.
Yeah. Awesome. Thank you for sharing that. And what would you say are books, resources, podcasts, certifications, you name it, that would be helpful for
Ooh,
someone that wants to get into this profession? I know you mentioned Adobe is huge, and if you can familiarize yourself
yeah,
with it, you have like an edge, but what else would you recommend?
yes. Yeah, I think if you're familiar with Adobe, it would be a huge perk.
Yeah.
um, there's not like a specific book or podcast. Actually, there is that comes to mind. I'm not the biggest like podcast listener, but Monocle, which is sort of an unknown publication in the like world of editorials, is one that comes to mind because they do a lot of their content focuses on like shore style and fashion, but in the context of like real estate and retail with a global affairs sort of world politics edge to it. And I love reading their magazine, but they also have a podcast. They have a bunch. They have like a whole radio station, and one of them is called
Okay.
The Urbanist, yes. But I think they have a bunch of different sort of studies on like places that work and why certain cities work as well as they do, and have a good perspective that I think would have a lot of little nuggets in it that you would be able to use. So that comes to mind, as well as, just for fun. I think when you're reading through travel magazines and they recommend like this place as a whole
Mhm.
with all of its restaurants is worth visiting and seeing, I think understanding why is great and a big part of this role, as we've talked about. And that as a resource where, I love scanning those pages and seeing like the James Beard, for example, the James Beard
Yes.
finalists were released yesterday. And I think reading through that and being familiar with that is an asset to the profession because you get to know what are the restaurants that are doing the best work that we can be
Right.
looking up to and recommending something to our clients.
Awesome.
So
Yeah. Okay,
yeah,
so just remaining informed, like read into things, see what's working. That way you
yeah,
can talk about it, you can understand it better, and once you go into it, you can hopefully have a
yes,
little bit of an edge. Okay, yeah.
for
So
sure.
we are reaching the end of the interview, so I have two more questions
Cool.
for you. What would you tell your younger self when you were at the beginning of your
Ooh, oh,
career?
I think, oh gosh, there's so many things that I would say. Yeah, I think that, I don't know, I wish I could go back and tell her, like, one day you're going to be an entrepreneur, you're going to have the best time.
Yeah.
I don't know. I think that probably that it's okay to not practice architecture and that degree is a really valuable one to have, even if you don't get your license.
Yeah.
Because now that moving into residential real estate, that's like one of my big X factors, I would say,
Right.
is that I've got, if that's the right phrase, that I've got the architecture background. So
Right.
I think it's becoming more popular, I think, for students coming out of architecture school to not pursue like traditional and formal paths.
Okay.
Um, but I think also to maybe ride the waves a little bit and just like not be patient, but know that it's going to unfold as it should in all due time, and to, take what you can from the job that you're in, and when in terms of what you can learn and what you can sort of put in your toolkit for the next thing that you're going to go to. So I think all jobs sort of have seasons of ebbs and flows where you're loving it and where it's really challenging. And I think Street Sense definitely taught me this, to ask for what you want in a way and articulate that. I think some people that I've had challenging conversations with who might be unhappy in their current role and figuring out, like looking at us and our team and how shiny it was, and like getting to travel and all of this and getting to work on these cool projects. Um, no one can read your mind. And I think if there's something that you are dissatisfied with in your role, or is it unsatisfied, dissatisfied? Um, like you're in charge of your own destiny
Right.
ultimately. So either like speak up or find the next thing
Yeah.
and make it work for you.
Yeah. You
Yeah.
make you make it what it is, you get out whatever you put in and whatever you ask for, right? And that applies
Yeah,
almost anything on our day to day. So, yeah.
for
Okay.
sure.
So, Chesley, could you tell me a little bit about what you do today? Where can people reach out to you or follow along with what you're doing?
Yes. Now I am officially a real estate agent as of Friday at 4:30 p.m.
Yay!
Woo! Living and working in Washington, D.C. I also do photography and interior photography. So those two things kind of live together. And I can most easily be found on Instagram, I would say. So I am on LinkedIn, but I never check it. And it's probably not an accurate reflection of what I'm currently up to and doing. So,
Awesome. Well, we'll have those linked in the notes off the podcast. And thank you so much for joining me today. I appreciate everything you shared. It's going to be extremely valuable to young professionals like me who are still in
woo!
college and trying to figure out what we are going to do. And appreciate you
Yeah,
for joining me.
for sure. Thanks for having me. This was fun.
You just got one episode closer to learning about the world of jobs out there. To explore the rest of our career categories and find your best fit, go to jobdictionary.com to sign up for the beta users waitlist. Then subscribe here to find the next episodes coming out this week. And as always, drop us a comment, review, or message to let us know how we can better attune our episodes to your specific needs. Follow us on TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, X, Threads, Pinterest, and wherever else you're on socials to go get our short, snappy preview reels that expose you to new job options every day. Because here at Job Dictionary, we believe your big aha moment can be just one scroll away. Go check it out and get out there. Cheers!